Why is Africa unable to develop economically? Did you know that the underlying cause has been criticized as the system of economic exploitation created by France? The CFA franc is the common currency used in African countries. What exactly is the CFA franc, which has survived for more than 70 years, and how does it work? What kind of exploitation has France been doing in Africa through the CFA franc? In part 1 and part 2, we will explore France's greatest darkness. Hello everyone, my name is Kanta. Have you ever heard of the term CFA franc? In the part 1 video I uploaded the other day, I explained the problems with the CFA franc, a common currency used in African countries. This video is part 2. In part 2 we ask, why has the CFA franc persisted for over 70 years? While explaining the historical background of the CFA franc, we will consider the recent movement to abolish the CFA franc, as well as the conflict between Western countries and China and Russia from an African perspective. Please watch to the end. First of all, what is the CFA franc? Let's review the previous video. The CFA franc is a common currency used in countries in West and Central Africa that were once French colonies. A common currency is a currency that can be used commonly for transactions within a certain region. For example, the euro used in Europe is an example of a common currency. The CFA franc is unique in that it has a fixed exchange rate with the currency of France, the former colonial power in Africa. Since the common currency of the EU, the euro, is used in France today, the exchange rate is fixed at 1 euro equals 656 CFA francs. Various problems have been pointed out with the CFA franc, the first of which is the high exchange rate with the euro. What does it mean that the exchange rate is set at a high level? It means that the value of the CFA franc currency is set at a high level. Essentially, African countries where the CFA franc is used have weak economies, so the value of their currencies is correspondingly low. A low-valued currency is advantageous for exporting because the international prices of agricultural products, industrial goods, and natural resources produced in the country are relatively low. Under normal circumstances, African countries can develop their economies by taking advantage of the low value of their currencies and promoting exports. However, as mentioned earlier, the CFA franc has been criticized for preventing African countries from developing their economies because of its high exchange rate with the euro. Furthermore, there is a stipulation that member countries of the CFA franc must deposit 50% of the foreign currency they have in their countries in the French treasury. In other words, even if African countries that are members of the CFA franc earn foreign currency by exporting, half of it will be taken by France. This too has been criticized as having hindered the economic development of African countries. In addition, the countries that are members of the CFA franc cannot issue currency at their own discretion. CFA francs are issued by the Central Bank of the African region, but the policy decisions of this central bank are only made if they are unanimous by a board of directors composed of representatives of several countries. Nevertheless, the board of directors of this board has always included elected officials from France. This means that, in effect, France has controlled the authority to issue the currencies of member countries. African countries that are members of the CFA franc have effectively lost the right to issue currency. Therefore, it has been pointed out that countries using the CFA franc have not had the freedom to make economic policy decisions. We have briefly explained the problems with the CFA franc, but for more details, please also check out the video in part 1. The CFA franc has its advantages. That is that France, a major economic power, guarantees the stability of its currency. Many African countries have become politically unstable after gaining independence from their colonies. An unstable currency value could trigger a coup d'etat or a demonstration by the people. However, the fixed exchange rate of the French currency means that even in the event of an economic collapse, the currency can be redeemed without losing value. Some say that the advantage of the CFA franc is that France, a major economic power, guarantees the value of its currency. The CFA franc has both advantages and disadvantages, and has generated a lot of controversy. However, as explained earlier, for example, the fact that 50% of the country's foreign currency must be deposited in the French treasury means that it has become an important source of income for France. In other words, we can say that the CFA franc has survived until now because of its great advantages for France. The original CFA franc mechanism was introduced in 1945, when France was still colonizing African countries. Since then, the CFA franc system has been in place for more than 70 years, so why has it persisted for so long? To understand this point, let's take a look at the history of France and the African countries that were under French colonial rule. Most of Africa was under colonial rule by European countries from the 19th to the mid-20th centuries. The area in blue on this map was under French colonial rule. The African continent was divided and ruled by 7 European countries, including Britain and France. France mainly controlled the region from West Africa to Central Africa. It was not until the 1950s and early 1960s that the African countries that had been French colonies gained their independence. A major turning point was the War of Independence that took place in French Algeria between 1954 and 1962. In the midst of this bloody war, in which it was estimated that as many as 1 million Algerians died, then French President de Gaulle implemented a policy of independence for the colonies. Why did President de Gaulle implement the policy of independence for the colonies? The main reason was that after the end of World War II, there was an active movement for independence from colonial rule in Asia and Africa, and the end of colonial rule was considered inevitable. On the other hand, a war of independence, as in the case of Algeria, could have resulted in poor relations with France. It is pointed out that the reason why President de Gaulle implemented the policy of independence was because France was planning to remain influential after the end of colonial rule by granting independence before a war broke out. As a result of French President de Gaulle's policies, 13 former French colonies were granted independence in 1960, and the year was known as the Year of Africa. The name Year of Africa may sound like a hopeful year for Africa. In reality, however, there was also a political agenda on the part of France. Colonial rule is the most vested interest ever. It is inconceivable that France and other European countries would suddenly and completely give up their vested interests. The French side also had a situation that they could not compromise. During the period of colonial rule, France had invested in various African countries. However, it would be a great loss for France if the African countries were to unilaterally become independent without France recovering its investment. As I mentioned earlier, some argue that the CFA franc was beneficial to the African countries after independence, which were prone to economic instability because France guaranteed the value of their currency. On the other hand, there was also the political intention of France to leave its influence after the end of colonial rule. Because of this historical background, the CFA franc mechanism survived between France and African countries even after the end of colonial rule. The status of a country as independent means that its government or central bank has the right to issue its own currency or currency issuing power. However, African countries that are members of the CFA franc have lost their right to issue currency, even after gaining independence from French colonies. It is said that France has controlled African countries through various means in order to maintain the CFA franc, which is a favorable mechanism for France and a major vested interest. One major means is international aid. In the past, France has provided a great deal of international aid to CFA franc member countries, but this has been accompanied by a political agenda to maintain the CFA franc mechanism. Many of the countries that are members of the CFA franc are economically poor, such as Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Chad, and these countries have frequently experienced food shortages due to droughts and other factors. When food shortages occur, the situation in these African countries becomes unstable. Therefore, France has provided enormous amounts of food aid to these countries to ensure their stability. In addition to food aid, military assistance has also been provided. While insurgent and terrorist activities are rampant in these regions, France has been working to stabilize security by deploying its own troops. The fact that countries that are members of the CFA franc receive economic and military support from France means that they cannot defy France. The fact that they cannot go against France also means that the CFA franc mechanism, which is beneficial to France, will be maintained. It is important to understand that this political agenda is also hidden behind the international aid. Some leaders called for complete independence from France and for African self-reliance. However, it is said that those politicians who tried to escape French economic exploitation, such as the abolition of the CFA franc, would be disqualified by military coups or other means. For example, some social activists in West Africa who view the CFA franc system as problematic make this claim. The CFA is destroying Benin's economy and industry by making the CFA exchange rate more favorable to France, allowing many French products, from soap to chicken, to enter Benin at lower prices. Benin's products cannot compete on price. The economy of Benin cannot stand on its own as a result of its continued dependence on imports. Even if the presidents of West African countries wanted to abolish the CFA, they would be assassinated by France if they said so. Politicians have no choice but to do as France says. West Africa is in a state of economic slavery. West Africa, including Benin, has not yet achieved independence. The word assassination may sound a bit like a conspiracy theory to some people, but in the history of Africa, assassinations of African leaders who stood up to European and American domination have been a frequent occurrence. For example, my Japanese channel once covered the historical fact that Patrice Lumumba, the leader of the Independent Democratic Republic of Congo, was assassinated by a Belgian and American conspiracy after he declared the nationalization of Congo's natural resources. It is very difficult to speak with certainty about political assassinations because information is rarely made public, but is it true that politicians who have attempted to abolish the CFA franc have been assassinated? Here are some possible stories. For example, Modibo Keita, the first president of the Republic of Mali, a country that gained its independence in 1960, had been calling for African independence by attempting to introduce Mali's own currency, the Mali franc. However, he was later ousted in a military coup in 1968. After being sent to prison, he spent nearly 10 years there before his suspicious death on May 16, 1977. Gaddafi, who was planning to introduce a common African currency, the dinar, was killed by military intervention by NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Some claim that French intelligence was involved behind this killing of Gaddafi. The French government, of course, denies such claims, but information about political assassinations rarely comes to light. Until now, France has had a great deal of influence over the African countries that are members of the CFA Franc. However, in recent years, the situation is changing. In other words, France's influence has become relatively weak. This is due to the presence of China and Russia, which have been increasing their influence in Africa in recent years. In the past, France has provided economic and military support to African countries. In recent years, however, China's economic influence and Russia's military influence in the region have been growing. France is no match for China economically and no match for Russia militarily. Of course, there are various criticisms of the Chinese and Russian approaches. For example, when it comes to China, African countries need to give China the right to mine their natural resources in exchange for support from China. Also, little by little, they can be put into debt, and the right to use infrastructure such as roads and ports can be seized by China. However, African peoples have been subjected to European domination for hundreds of years so far, from the slave trade to colonial rule. There are many local people who are fed up with France. In fact, in recent years, more and more people in Africa have become aware of the system of economic exploitation by France through the CFA Francs, and there have even been protests saying, "Enough, I want independence from French rule." What is important here is that with the advance of China and Russia, there are now other sources of support for African countries besides France. As long as France was the only source of support, they had no choice but to follow France's lead. However, with the entry of China and Russia, other sources of support have emerged. This has allowed African countries to be more politically forceful, as they no longer have to be at the complete mercy of France. In fact, in 2019, it was decided to abolish the CFA franc for its circulation in West Africa and introduce a new common currency for West Africa called ECO. After the new currency, the ECO, is introduced, half of the foreign exchange reserves will no longer have to be paid into the French treasury. It has also been decided that France will no longer be represented on the board of the Central Bank of West Africa, which had previously issued the CFA franc. However, it has been pointed out that the common currency, the ECO, is also under the control of France, which fears losing its vested interests if the CFA franc is abolished. While French-speaking African countries that are good friends of France are positive, 6 English-speaking countries, including Nigeria, have announced that they will not introduce the ECO in January 2020. It is said that this is due to a political conflict between France, which wants to retain influence over West Africa after the CFA franc is abolished, and Nigeria, which is the economic powerhouse of West Africa and wants to have influence in the entire region. In June 2021, it was also announced that the introduction of a new common currency, ECO, would be postponed until 2027 due to the economic damage caused by the COVID-19 epidemic. It may take some more time before African countries can completely escape French financial domination. What worldview can we learn from this series of stories related to CFA franc? African countries have been exploited by France and other European countries for hundreds of years, including colonial rule and CFA francs. We may finally be able to escape from the exploitation of Western countries that has continued for hundreds of years. In fact, the recent expansion of China and Russia has indirectly supported the hopes of African people. In 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Just looking at the Western media, you may have the impression that the whole world is blaming Russia. However, in the resolution to condemn Russia that was voted on by the UN General Assembly immediately after Russia began its invasion of Ukraine, as many as half of the 54 African countries chose to abstain or not participate in the resolution. Of course, there has been a lot of criticism of China and Russia, that is true. However, African people have been subjected to centuries of slave trade, colonial rule, and even economic exploitation by Western nations since their independence. They are more sensitive than we think to the double standard of the Western world, that is, the hypocrisy of shelving their own affairs and criticizing other countries. If you look at the current international situation from an African perspective, your worldview may change dramatically. Kanta's channel explains various issues in the world that are difficult to learn about through other channels. The important thing is not to be interested in world events, but to stay interested. Please subscribe to my channel to keep your interest. Thank you again for watching to the end. See you again in the next video.